Well, there's a lot of times in our life where we're just not ready. I ran into one of those about a year and a half ago when my wife was telling me about a week away from us having our son. My wife kept telling me, Josiah, get your bag ready. Get your go bag ready. Get your hospital bag ready. And my response to her over and over again was, yeah, I know, babe, I just came in later. Babe, I'll get it done when I have some time. And, I'll get to that a little bit later in the week. I won't forget. I'll make sure. Well, she goes into having this pain, and the moment finally comes. And she's saying, Josiah, I'm ready to go. It's go time to the hospital. Let's do this. And as she's in this pain, she says, I got my bag. Go grab your bag. And I grab my green duffel bag and realize it is completely empty and I am totally unprepared. If I could give you a picture of the look that my wife gave me. Some of you guys have that. You see that look sometimes. Your wife gives you the eyes is what I say. It's like, I told you. So she's in this mess. Give me a minute. I'm scrambling. I'm throwing, what do I need? How long am I going to be there? My first thinking was we were going to leave after the first night. She said, you don't know what you're talking about. So I'm throwing all this stuff in, getting ready, and I'm barely ready, get all my stuff in that moment to be able to get in the car, to be able to go to the hospital and have that little precious baby boy. That was a pretty horrible moment in that time to not be prepared. You're warned, you're given instruction, you're told, get ready, and you ignore that or push it off and prolong it, and then the moment hits you, the moment's upon you, and you're not ready, and you're scrambling to try to get ready to be there in the moment. I believe that this word today has that same essence to it. I believe that God has given us words and instructions and warnings as a church that we need to get ready because God is going to bring a once-in-a-generation harvest. I believe that there is a move of the Spirit of God that is coming just around the corner. That God is saying, church, you need to be prepared. Get ready. Align yourself with me because there's a window of time you have to prepare before the season opens up. And when the season opens up, if you're not ready, you will miss it. You tracking with me? There's an urgency, a preparedness that we need to have. And so I want to bring us to a passage that I believe is going to give us a framework of readiness for us to be prepared as a church as a whole, but also individually be prepared in our walk with Jesus. So I want you to join me in Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, verse 35. Now what Jesus is talking here when he's talking about readiness is he's talking about being ready for the second coming. Being ready for Jesus to return again, not coming as a lamb to be slain, but as a king to reign. He will come again, Maranatha. Jesus will come again for his church. Jesus will come and the trumpet will blow. Jesus will come and bring his saints back to himself. That time is guaranteed and coming. We just don't have a date. So Jesus is speaking to his followers. He's speaking to a large crowd of people, but there's followers there, his disciples. And he wants to tell them, you need to be ready. Here's a few pictures of being ready. Luke chapter 12, verse 35 says this. Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamp burning, like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. Verse 39, but understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not let his house be broken into. You, here's the word for us, you and I must be ready because the Son of Man, Jesus, will come at an hour when you do not expect him. When we do not expect him. If you're taking notes this morning, we're talking about 3 ways to be ready. I want you to write this down. Number 1, we get ready by living with urgency. Living with urgency. Jesus here, speaking to a large crowd and his disciples, gives us 4 pictures of what readiness looks like. 4 pictures of people that were ready. The first one is a picture of somebody says, clothed and be ready for service. In Jesus' day, they would wear robes or tunics, long cloth, and when they were going to get ready to do something, they would pull that robe up above their knee, tie it around their waist like a sweater, so that if they were gonna go run, or gonna go to their work, or they were gonna go fight in a battle, they wouldn't be tripped up by having their robe all the way down. They would tie it up and say, now I'm ready for whatever comes next. If you've seen some fight videos, this is the equivalent of a guy taking off his shirt like he's ready for that fight, right? This is the picture. Jesus is saying, be ready. The second picture that he gives us is a picture of a lamp that's burning. This is you waiting for somebody to come back at night, and you're waiting for your wife, and so you keep the lights on because you don't want to fall asleep with the TV that's playing in the background. So you keep the light on because you're expecting someone's return. Keep the light on. Don't shut the light off and be unprepared for their arrival. That's the second picture. The third picture Jesus gives us of somebody that's ready, he says that it's servants that are waiting for their master to return from a wedding. Now, our weddings have a start day, have a start time, and we generally know a few hours and the wedding party will be over. In ancient Israel, their weddings could last up to 7 days long. That's a lot of moolah. 7 days long. So when Jesus hear what he's saying, these servants had no clue when their master was coming back. They didn't get a text message. It was 7 days that they had to be prepared, because when that master knocked, they needed to be ready to open the door immediately when the master got there. That's the third picture. And the fourth one is an owner that knows that there's a thief that's going to break in and knows what time. 10 p.m., this thief is gonna try to break in. He's gonna try to pick my lock. And so I am gonna be prepared to meet this thief at the door so they don't steal my stuff. 4 pictures Jesus gives us, saying these are pictures of readiness. These are pictures of somebody that's prepared and ready, and he brings it to us and says, you, like these pictures, me, like these pictures, need to be ready. Peter says in verse 41, Lord, are you telling this parable to us, your disciples, or is this to everyone? And Jesus replies to him, who then is faithful and wise manager? Peter's saying, Lord, is this just kind of like a general thing, or is this for me, Jesus? Because sometimes we like to kind of push off our readiness that, well, you know, that's for the pastor. That's for that really committed Christian. That's for that person that's really serious about their faith. They really need to be ready. And what Jesus is speaking to Peter is he's saying, no, you, Peter, you need to be ready. This is for you. This word is generally, it's gonna go out to the people, but this word is specifically for anyone that's a follower. Be ready, be prepared. And he gives us 2 pictures of people, 2 different servants that have a spirit. One has a spirit of readiness and one doesn't have a spirit of readiness. The first one, he says, has 2 characteristics. They're faithful and they're wise. They're faithful and they're wise. There's an expectation that their master is coming back. And I'll tell you what, you cannot be ready for what God has next You cannot be ready for that breakthrough that you've been praying for. You cannot be ready for that harvest that's about to come. You cannot be ready for that trial that God is gonna use to develop you unless you are faithful and wise. As we're talking about getting ready, let's go there. Let's be honest with ourselves. How are you as a follower of Jesus? Are you faithful with what he's entrusted you with? What are you doing with your time, talent, and treasure? Are you faithful to say what God has uniquely gifted you and blessed you with it? Are you using that just for your own benefit? Or are you saying, Jesus, my life is yours? Whatever I have, I wanna make sure that I am faithful with that, God, whether it's a lot or a little, because I wanna be ready. Are you wise with what you have? Specifically, let's talk about our time. God has entrusted each and every one of us with a certain amount of minutes and hours before we go and see him again. Are you living in a way right now where you're living wise with your time? You're using it in the best way. You're investing it into the kingdom. You're doing things that are gonna make a difference in eternity. Are you being wise and faithful with what God's entrusted you? Because Jesus is saying, if you're gonna be ready, then a ready person is faithful and wise with what they have. Picture of a manager and a steward of your life. But then he says there's this other servant. He says, but suppose, verse 45, for the servant that's not ready. But suppose the servant says to himself, my master is taking a long time in coming, and he begins to beat the other servants, both men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk. One of the greatest dangers to us living faithful and wise, for us to be ready, is thinking that I have more time. I talk with some people in their young 20s. They say, I don't know if I'm ready to give my life to the Lord yet. We share the gospel, we talk about it. Oh, I believe in God, but I wanna make sure I kind of enjoy my 20s. I'm young, I gotta sow my oats, I gotta experience things, I gotta be open and able to do whatever I need to do. And so they say, but in the future, down the road, then I'm gonna live for God. There's this emphasis, there's this idea, this lie that we're promised tomorrow. Sometimes I talk with people who say, I'm building my business right now. And I say, oh man, that's great, good for you, work hard, make a difference in that area. And they say, but hey, are you investing in the kingdom? I know you're building your empire, but are you investing in the kingdom? Well, now I'm real busy right now. In the future, down the road, when I retire, then I'm really gonna give it to God, and I'm gonna use my gifts and my ability and my talent and my treasure. And what Jesus is saying is, if that's the mentality that we have, then we are not ready. We're not promised tomorrow. We're not promised next week. We're not promised after retirement. We're not promised after our 20s. I can tell you story after story, and you guys even know the story of our brother Jason that had to go through what he went through with his family. His son was on the side of the road, a semi truck goes, the tire blows off of it and hits his 15-year-old son that sits right here every single week in the head. And after a few days in the hospital, he's with the Lord. Right here. Right here. And yet his life in 3 days, freak accident, is gone. Life is short. My question to you is, are you ready? Are you ready for Jesus to return? Are you ready to stand before your Maker? Are you ready for God to move in a powerful way? In this emphasis of living a long time, this idea, he gives us the language that people live for themselves and they live for pleasure. They allow themselves to be dulled by the comfort of the world, and they allow themselves to think, I have more time, let me just enjoy pleasure. but we have more than a purpose than just pleasure. In 2019, I was on a vision trip, and I was on this trip. There was a small moment of that time. It's almost hard to describe in language because it was such a surreal, out-of-body moment that I had. But as I was here in this small Airbnb, we're studying, we're thinking, I felt like the Lord gave me a picture for our church, saying a picture of readiness for our church with urgency. Let me describe the picture to you. I was in the Chicago theater downtown, and there's all these red seats and there's beautiful gold ornate carvings and these big red curtains at the front, closed. And the first scene, I'm in the back of the room, sitting towards the back, I'm standing, and I see all the sanctuary, all this room, all this auditorium is empty, and there's maybe 4 or 5 people that are walking through the aisles trying to find their seat in the room. And the second scene, I get catapulted forward, and I'm on the stage, and I felt like God put my head behind the curtain. So my head is behind these 2 big red curtains, and I'm able to look around and see what's happening. I don't move, I just stand in this position. I'm looking around to see with my head behind the curtain. And let me tell you what I saw. I saw all of these people dressed in black that were stagehands that were running back and forth, trying to get everything ready for a moment that was gonna come. And they're running and they're moving, and there's this urgency. Did you get this? Did you get that? Make sure. Hey, did you go? We're gonna. And there's just all of this energy behind the room, all of this running, preparing for a moment that's about to come. And I didn't have this, like, here's exactly what that means written out word for word, but I had a clear understanding in that moment, deposited into my spirit. I felt like this is exactly what God is saying. Josiah, don't miss this. When I felt like the Lord was speaking to me, as I felt like the Lord was saying, in this vision, the 36 years of history that you guys have at a church is amazing. I have done some amazing things amongst this people. I have brought people from death to life in numerous ways. I have brought people that were suicidal and allowed them to have joy like they've never imagined. I brought people that were addicts of drugs and brought them from that and allowed them to have life in me that have been now clean for decades in this church. And there was this understanding that God had done such an amazing work in our church, and yet God was saying in this picture, what he was saying to me, it was, but that was Act 1, preparing for Act 2. That was preparation. That was just build up until what I'm gonna do next. That God is going to open up the floodgates. He's gonna do a show and open up these curtains in only his time, a show that he has been preparing for decades in Chicago. Decades. And when this, if you've ever been at one of those shows, you know, once people find their seats, the music starts to play, saying, find your seat, get ready. People find their seat, and then these curtains open up and the show starts. And what God was saying in this picture to me is, Josiah, I have been building this up to a moment, but you need to make sure that you and New Life are in the seat ready for me to do what I do. Because if you don't take this serious, you won't be in the seat. And when it's time for those curtains to open up, there won't be any seats left. There was a sense of this master plan, and my mind started to think, well, God, I wonder, God, is it possible that you've allowed Chicago to take on the darkness that it has for a reason? Have you allowed Chicago to be known around the country and the world for our violence and corruption for a reason? Have you allowed it to have such a darkness, God, that we would be known across the world for this, so that when a moment comes where you step into Chicago and you light a fire, is it possible, God? Is it possible that we could be part of a once-in-a-generation harvest that you have been building up with your saints for decades? Is it possible, God, that what you could do in Chicago, that places around the world would start to say, God, if you could do it in Chicago, then you could do it in LA. God, if you could do it in Chicago, then God, you could do it in New York. God, if you could do it in Chicago, then God, you could do it in London. God, if you could do what you did in Chicago, then maybe it gives people a chance to start believing, and Chicago becomes the domino, the epicenter of a move of God that we would just be able to have the privilege to be a part of. And my question for you is, if God was to do something like that, would we be ready? There was people who were they just wanted to know Jesus, and they were looking for people. Would we have enough disciple makers in the house to say, oh, sign me up, Pastor. I'm ready to help that person grow in their faith? Would we be ready? Because when that door opens, when that curtain opens and God does something that he has been preparing, it has been his work and he will get the glory. Will we be ready as a church? Jesus continues in Luke, and he tells us that when these things happen, that his framework of how he does things is that he doesn't just randomly make it happen, but that he shows you signs and gives you pictures to help you prepare to know that it's gonna happen. Listen to Jesus' words. Luke chapter 12, verse 54 says this. He said to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say it's going to rain, and it does. When the south wind blows, you say it's going to be hot, and it is. Hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret this present time? Jesus is looking out at a crowd and speaking to people that when they see a dark cloud that's coming, they go, oh, it's gonna rain later. I could see it. And when they would feel this wind blowing that would come off the desert, they would say, oh, I know where that wind's coming from here. Oh, that's the desert. It's gonna be really warm next week. They would look at the signs. They would look at the clouds in the air, feel the wind, and they could tell the weather without all of our modern technology, because before it rains, there's always clouds. And Jesus looks at these people and says a strange kind of word. He says, hypocrites. Hypocrites? Hypocrites. Well, why does Jesus say hypocrites? Well, Jesus says, listen, you can discern the weather, but you can't tell what season it is. He says you can look at the clouds and you can say, oh, it's gonna rain, but you can't tell what season it is. You can tell the physical things, but you're unaware of the spiritual things. How many of you know that we live in a spiritual world? Hey, we may be physically here, but there is a spiritual world that's all around us. There is a battle that is waging all around us. And sometimes we live our physical existence in ignorance of the spiritual world that's around us. We can't see it, so we don't believe it. Jesus is saying, listen, you can look at the clouds and you can feel the wind and you can tell what's coming next. And he says, hypocrites, because I'm standing in front of you. There's 300 prophetic words about me in this moment coming. Hey, you can see the signs around you. I'm healing people. I'm walking on water. And yet you see my power and you cannot tell the moment that you're in. You cannot discern the season that you're in. You're blind to being able to name the moment that you're in. Listen, not every season and not every moment is like the last. Ecclesiastes says there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the sun. I believe that in the same essence of what Jesus is saying in his coming, that there are signs. I believe that when there are breakthroughs and harvests, there are signs. And I believe the season, if we're to name it, the season that we've come out of has been a season of pruning, has been a season of testing. Man, has anybody felt tested over the last 3 or 4 years? Can we be honest? 2 people, come on, can we be honest this morning? Yes? I prayed with half of you in the room, guys. I know what's going on, come on. We've been through a testing, we've been through a shaking over the last few years, where God has been shaking to see who's committed, shaking to see who stands. We've seen more problems come out of this last season, the division, the brokenness, the challenge, the pressure. But I believe that season, we've entered into a new season and the last season is behind us. I feel like the season that we're in now is different. It's changed. And when we look at the clouds, I believe the season that we're in right now is a season of building the foundation. I believe we're in a season of preparation. I believe, and I don't know how long this season's gonna last, I believe we have a short window to prepare before God is going to enter us into a season that is going to be a season of a magnificent, prayed for by many saints, harvest that we will be able to reap. While we're in this season though, in this moment, we need to identify it so that we can act. If we're in a season of preparation, we need to know that so we can act. Let me share with you one of the reasons why I believe we're in a season of preparation right now. There was a prophetic word, and every prophetic word, let me say this, every prophetic word that's given, a word that's given, we see it in the Old Testament, I believe prophetic words are still given now. They always need to be tested and discerned. You know, not everybody that says, I feel like God told me to marry you, should you marry? Amen. This word was given by a pastor who lives in London. He's 2011. This is given over 10 years ago. And I'm not gonna read it for all of it for time's sake, but let me generalize the beginning and read one specific line to you, but I believe is important for us to move forward with clarity. So this pastor's name is Peter, and Peter says, he said he had this picture looking over Chicagoland like you were flying into Midway Airport. And he said as he looked over Chicagoland area in this vision, there was a darkness over the city of Chicago. It was an economic darkness, it was a social darkness, but he said at the root of it was a spiritual darkness. And he says as he looked over, he saw across Chicagoland area, this big map, this aerial view, he saw these lights across Chicagoland area, these lighthouses. And he said, I understood and knew as I saw this picture that these were churches, people of the redeemed, places that in the middle of the darkness could not overcome it. And as he sees this picture, he says, it's getting worse. There's lost all this hope. People are desperate to find solace, security, and meaning. I mean, there is deep distress. And he says this, he says, I believe that there has been a time of training for reigning for a season which is just about to open. That what we've been doing has been a buildup for what's coming next. And I'll quote him here, he says, then I heard a clear voice. This is the time of harvest, a greater time of my kingdom's advance than for generations. And so there's this sense of we've come through turmoil and all of this stuff, and we're going into a season of breakthrough and harvest. But you say, well, Pastor, why do you think that word that was written in November of 2011 is for us now? Why, Pastor? Well, let me tell you, I'll read it for you. See, one of the interesting things about this is it talks about something that has never happened in our 36-year history. This word is specifically to new life. And this is what it says. In my understanding, these locations, talking about our churches, these locations will merge being places of worship with being compassion centers, storehouses, places where physical, social, and spiritual needs are met. Some would be distribution centers for the supply of food, clothing, and overnight shelter. We have been doing food, a very small operation of food in Little Village for 10 years plus, but it's been, 100 people every single week. You know the story. In 2020, I got on a call with Pastor Matt and he said, hey, we have 500 names that need food. And we went in under 2 months' time, we went from feeding 100 people a week to feeding 30,000 people a week across Chicagoland area. I mean, we had been doing food, but we hadn't been doing food, right? I mean, this was a whole other level, and we still continue to be the number one partner that's moving food across Chicagoland area at multiple locations, feeding thousands and thousands and thousands of people a month for the glory of Jesus. The ministry is called Pan de Vida, bread of life. Why? Because we're not just trying to feed people life, we're trying to point them to the bread of life, Jesus. And he says, so food. Then he says clothing and overnight shelter. In 36 years of history, we have never, at any point in our church's story, God has done amazing things. We have never, ever opened up our buildings to have people live in them. The liability, the challenge, it's just, we don't have shop. All of this is just like, that sounds like really difficult to deal with. 10 months ago, never before in our history, way after this word is written, we get a call from the city and state, we need help. Can you open the church buildings to have people sleep in the buildings and live in the buildings? We said there's a need, we'll meet it. Today, I got a text yesterday from one of our pastors. Again, we're opening up one of our buildings to house 75 migrants in it. Why? Because they need space and we're here to answer it. So in the same building, where praises and worship and the word is going forward in the room above, and down below, there's 75 migrants that are being ministered to by the people in the church, that are being loved on by the people in the church, that are being cared for by the people in the church. And I say, wow. When this word happened, I have no idea how or if that would even happen in our story. And until the last 10 months, now that has become part of our story. So I'm asking you, is it possible? Is it possible that God, as he uses his framework of giving words and signs, is it possible that God is preparing our church and saying, listen, this word that was given 10 years ago is to prepare you for a moment that is to come. Are you ready? After the pandemic, there's been a greater openness. They've been saying the church is going to decline for decades now, and there's been a decline in people's commitment to a church. There's been a decline in people making the decision, but I'll tell you this, after the pandemic, 44% of people are more open to God than they were before the storm. 44% of people. I listened to a pastor in Indianapolis. He was preaching, leads a very large church, and he said, every 50 years, God brings a revival. God brings a harvest. We're due for one, he said. And this is what we've been saying for 2 years now, but in February of 2023, the whole world was brought into this conversation of revival with the Asbury revival. You remember seeing all across social media this little school in this little country town that just started praying and seeking God, and God just seemed to open the floodgates and allow there to be a move of his spirit that was unusual. People were so hungry for it. They were traveling across the country just to get a glimpse of what God is doing. And I'm asking myself, as we're looking at the signs and trying to discern these words, as we're trying to discern the season, what I'm asking myself as your pastor is God giving us signs and words to prepare ourselves in this moment? Because he wants us to be ready to be a church that captures the harvest when God opens the curtains. I don't know if she's in this service, so I'll just say there's a woman that came here in the last few weeks. You want to talk about in our church, what we're seeing? I'm seeing it every single week. 3 weeks ago when I was here, 4 weeks ago when I was here, there was a woman that was brought up. She comes up to me, and she comes up with he's actually in this room, I see him. He comes up with, actually, I'll point him out. He's right here. Comes up with this woman, and so they come up, and she's a Muslim woman. She comes up to me and she says, hi, great to meet you. And I said, hey, great to meet you as well. I'm so glad that you're here. She says, let me tell you why I'm here. I had a dream. She said, I had a dream that in my dream, my father came up to me and pulled the hijab off of my head and said, go to the Christian church. Go to the Christian church. As a Muslim woman, she has a dream that compels her enough that she shows up at a Christian church to talk with a Christian pastor because there was such a stirring dream in her head that told her to go to the Christian church. She said, I've lived in this community for 20 years, but I was so compelled by this dream that I had to come here. See, I want you to be aware that God is working in a unique way. So then this brother right here went, she needed some food because her husband lost her job. So he went and got her groceries, brought the groceries here back to the church. And as we brought the groceries back to church, another couple ministered to them, drove her home with the groceries, prayed with her outside of her house. She has been attending every week since. And I talked with her at the outside service, and she told me this. She said, I love it here. I love it amongst these people. And I thought, God, she doesn't know you yet. But I looked her right in the eye and said, I want you to know that dream was not by chance. Jesus Christ, the overseer of your soul, is calling you to himself. And he loves you enough that he's not gonna wait for somebody to share the gospel. He's gonna give you a dream that compels you to come to a church that's preaching the gospel so that you can find life in Jesus and Jesus alone. We are in a season of unusual activity, and we need to be prepared for what God is doing. Let me finish with this final thought because it brings it home for us. We need to finish by getting ready, by getting things right. Jesus says in verse 57, why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? As you are going with your adversary to the magistrate, try hard to be reconciled on the way, or your adversary may drag you off to the judge. And the judge turn you over to the officer, and the officer throw you into prison. I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid every last penny. Jesus here is talking to us about eternity. He's talking about his second coming, and he's giving us the first place that we need to be ready. He's saying, listen, you need to make sure that you're right with me. And he gives us this picture of two people that are walking on their way to the court. He said, if you don't get right with that person that wants to sue you before you're in the courtroom, it will be out of your hands and out of their hands, and it will be in the judge's hands. You have a window to get things right with that person before there's no more chance to get it right. And what he's saying in our sense, he's saying in the spiritual sense, he's saying, hey, listen, each and every one of us has a certain allotted time here on earth to get their life right with God through the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. We can't work for it. We can't earn it. We can't do enough good. No, we just trust in what Jesus has done on the cross. We turn and repent from our old ways and say, Jesus, you are God. Wash me and cleanse me of my sins. You died and resurrected after 3 days. My faith and trust is in what you've done, not what I can do. And when we live in this way and put our faith in Jesus, we are made right with the judge. There is one judge, and it is Almighty God himself. Almighty God. But if you're here in this room and you've never made that decision, let me tell you, your time is running out. I don't know when the end of your story is. You may have many, many, many years in front of you, or you may have minutes left. You may have a lot of time to weigh it, or to time when you're gonna come to Christ, or you may go before you ever think you're gonna go. And Jesus says, why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? What he's saying is, why don't you examine your life? He's talking about holiness. You're a believer in the room. He's saying, are you living in a way right now where you, first and foremost, are ready for your Savior to call you home to himself? Are there things are you living in a way right now where you say, I'm ready to go see Jesus. I feel like I'm not living perfect, but I am committed to him. Or are you pushing it off and saying, in the future I'll commit. In the future I'll give. In the future I'll surrender. In the future, because Jesus is saying, you may not have that time. So as followers of Jesus, he's saying, examine your life. Are there things in your life that need to get right with God? Are there things in your life that you need to get right with somebody else, a brother, a sister, a mother, a cousin, a neighbor? God's saying you may not have all the time that you think. And as we understand this in the essence of getting things right and ready, let me ask you this. First and foremost, have you given your life to Jesus? Are you ready? Some of you in this room haven't taken that first step of baptism, and Jesus is saying, you're not ready. You need to get ready by taking that step of baptism. You need to be ready. Some of you, it's not taking the step of baptism. It's, would you be ready to share the gospel and baptize somebody else? Are you ready? Not in the future, but are you ready? Are you ready using your gifts and your abilities for God? Are you ready living your life faithfully and wise? Are you ready where you are pursuing Jesus in the word and prayer? Are you ready? And is there something that you need to do to get ready with this urgency that we have that we're running out of time. If God was to open up the curtains in a year from now, would you be ready to say, God, as a soldier in your army, I am prepared. I'm not perfect, but I am prepared. I took seriously your promptings to be ready to capture what people have prayed for generations. I'm ready. I finished with this story. There was a kid that came. I don't know what service people are in, so I try to be general. There was a kid that came a couple weeks before Easter, and he was in a little village and had a gun pointed at himself on his way back from school, not involved in gangs, walking back with his girlfriend, gun pointed at him. And he's wrestling. His father brings him, and he brings him to the stage right over here to the left. He says, hey, pastor, I'm a believer. Would you pray for my son? This situation happened. He's really been shaken up since it happened. And so I said, I'm so sorry that happened. That's horrible. I know that really rocks you. I said, I'm gonna pray for peace, but before that, do you know Jesus? Because the ultimate peace and protection comes from Jesus. Shared the gospel with him. I said, are you ready to make that decision? He said, no, I'm not ready yet. So I prayed with him. I just prayed, peace, protection. At the end of it, again, I felt the Spirit prompting me, ask him again. So I said, hey, I can't pressure you. I don't wanna force you. This needs to be a decision that you're making, but I just wanna know, life's short. Do you need to make a decision to follow Jesus today? You can make him your Lord and your Savior. No, I'm not ready yet. Twice, I'm not ready. A few weeks go by, Easter Sunday, the final service, the last person to come up. Who comes up right here to the left side of the altar to make a decision to follow Jesus? That young kid that had his life shaken up, started to think about life and death. Started to think about, as a young guy, how life's short. Started to hear the gospel with fresh ears for the first time, and made a decision in a low moment to follow Jesus. And now he's a follower of Christ. That's how God works. That's how God works.